The mighty opening chord of A Hard Day's Night has a significance in Beatles lore matched only by the concluding E major of A Day in the Life, the two opening and closing the group's middle period of peak creativity. The song A Hard Day's Night, while fully written in 1964, traces its origins back to 1963. George remembers, Ringo would always say these funny, grammatically incorrect phrases and we'd all laugh. Paul adds, Ringo's malapropisms were delightful. He'd say things slightly wrong in a very lyrical, almost Lewis Carroll-like way. One notable instance was after a concert when Ringo said, "It's been a hard day's night." Paul recalls, John and I were like, "What? What did you just say?" Ringo replied, "I'm bloody knackered, man. It's been a hard day's night." I used to mix up my words. Once, after a long day and night, I said, "It's been a hard day," then realized it was night and added, "A hard day's night." Paul speculates in his book The Lyrics that Ringo's phrase may have been inspired by Eugene O'Neill's play Long Day's Journey into Night, which was popular in London at the time. John liked the phrase and used it in a poem for his book In His Own Right, written in late '63, which dispels the myth that Ringo coined the phrase during the movie's filming. John confirmed in 1980, it was an off-the-cuff remark by Ringo, one of those malapropisms, a Ringoism.
Originally, I thought the title of this first Beatle film would come from a title of one of the songs, one of the 6 songs they wrote for the picture. But when we got the songs, we realized that none of them seemed to be right for the movie. And obviously, we were being pressured by our distributor to come up with a title because they were trying to publicize the film. And we all thought about it, the director.
During a brainstorming session at Twickenham Studios, someone mentioned Ringo's phrase from the other day. Producer Bud Orenstein exclaimed, "We've got our title." Walter Shenson agreed, telling United Artists, "It's very provocative and sounds like a Beatles title." John adds, "On the way home, Dick Lesser decided to use that title. The next morning, I brought in the song." In the lyrics, Paul notes the title reflected their hectic lives, predominantly from John's perspective.
I asked John Lennon if he and Paul would write a title song called A Hard Day's Night. And he said, "Well, where are we going to use it? We're all finished shooting most of the picture." And I said, "Well, we'll use it over the title sequence, which is going to be the 4 of you running away from your fans. And we need a nice, fast song to start the picture. And it will be called A Hard Day's Night." He said, "Well, what are the lyrics going to be like?" And I said, "John, you're the lyricist, you're the writer, I'm not. A hard day's night till I come home to you." He said, "Oh, that's terrible." I said, "Well, that's why you're the songwriter and I'm not."
John and Paul played the new song for me the next day. It was a hit on demand, almost impossible, but one of their biggest hits ever.
It seems a bit ridiculous writing a song called Hard Day's Night because it sounded funny at the time.
A Hard Day's Night was the first Beatles track to earn the respect of serious listeners, breaking away from their Moptop image to showcase John's passionate soul. Even though it wasn't obvious at the time, it marked a turning point in the Beatles' artistic evolution. The song combines various influences, a cowboy gallop spurred by a Wilson Pickett cowbell, underscored by Buddy Holly's tomtoms, and a distinctive middle section, creating a sound that felt entirely original. The entire composition is written in the mixolydian mode, an ancient vocal scale abandoned back at the dawn of the modern tonality in the 17th century, but preserved in British, Irish, and American folk song. Though cast in the familiar form of a love song, its real theme is work, the hard, earnest, exhausting labor that men must perform to survive. This shift from romantic themes to more profound topics became a hallmark of John's songwriting, even though it went completely against the grain of the Beatles' success. For once the boys went commercial, they adopted the policy of writing nothing but love songs aimed at the teeny bopper market. The first 100 songs by Lennon-McCartney deal exclusively with the theme of boy-girl love. While Paul seemed okay with this, it started to bother John by this point. The recording session for it, on April 16th at EMI Studio 2, lasted only 3 hours. Journalists Maureen Cleave and director Richard Lester were present, along with George Martin and engineers Norman Smith and Jeff Emmerich. Maureen Cleave helped finish the lyrics, suggesting changes. She recalls, "The song materialized as if by nothing, noting the unrehearsed state evident in Take 1, included in the Anthology 1 album, with Paul's mistakes and George's rough guitar solo. Richard Lester's presence in the studio also helped a lot." Jeff Emmerich explains, "Lester insisted on a blockbuster opening, leading to John and George's crashing guitar chord." George Martin adds, "We wanted a strong start for the film and soundtrack. The strident guitar chord was perfect." Lester also suggested the song's dreamy fade-out to segue into the movie's first scene, which was implemented before the first recording attempt.
George Martin's helping on film music. Yeah. So because this was the opening to this film, Beatles' first film, bang, we do the chord, but he's augmented it. You can see he's thinking film. Bang!
Despite some stumbles, the Beatles performed it well. Emmerich notes their improved professionalism, though Paul struggled with the bass part and bridge lyrics, and George stopped attempting the guitar solo for later overdubbing. All four Beatles played and sang simultaneously, a standard practice at the time. By Take 9, with John and George Martin's approval, the song was completed despite Lester's request for another take being ignored by Martin. Shortly after his passing, an interviewer asked John's Aunt Mimi what her favorite John song was.
Of all the songs that John composed and sang, was there a favorite one that you enjoyed?
Well, I don't know. I think A Hard Day's Night's not so bad at the present time.
I remember Brian getting very excited about the fact that the Beatles had been offered a movie. And, of course, he'd done a deal with United Artists, not for one, but for 3, as a kind of package deal. And like quite a few of Brian's things, it wasn't all that great a deal. In fact, I believe the movie was made for less money than the first album of the Beatles created.
When the Beatles were first told by Brian Epstein, "I can set up a movie for you," they didn't want to do it because they were looking at past track records of the movie business, and the whole standard of pop music on film was not good in the early 60s. They had no storylines at all. You would have a parade of guest artists coming on and performing, not even their hit singles, but you know, a fairly bad single written specially for the soundtrack of the movie. So the press weren't at all moved by the fact that there was going to be a film made.
United Artists approached me and asked me if I'd make a film for them. And I thought they had a script or a book or something. And I said, "What have you got?" And they said, "Well, we want to make a movie with the Beatles." I said, "Sure, I'd be happy to." So they introduced me to Brian, and I guess he thought I was okay. And next thing I do, I had to meet the Beatles. Well, the first meeting I had with him, Brian Epstein was supposed to bring them to my office in London, and he showed up on time, but the Beatles, they didn't come. Brian came, and he apologized. He said, "I'm afraid we'll have to do it some other time, but they're over at EMI Studios at Abbey Road in on a session that another group that Brian had managed, so I have to go over there to meet them." So I said, "Well, can I go with you?" And he said, "Certainly." So we jumped in a taxi, and he said, "Well, let's stop by their apartment here in London first." And sure enough, they all came down looking for a taxi. So they jumped into our taxi, and you know, London taxis are only for 4, so there's 6 of us in there. And I thought I was in the middle of a Marx Brothers movie. Every time the taxi stopped, they'd grab all the newspapers that had Beatle headlines, which they did. And I asked the Beatles, when could we start filming? And John opened up his little diary, and he said, "Well, we're going to the Bahamas for a holiday." And then in February, he said, "We're going to go to your country. We're going to go to New York and do something called the Ed Sullivan Show." And I said, "Well, that'll be fine. While you're in the Bahamas, write at least 6 new songs for our picture." And John said, "Well, what's the film about?" And I said, "I don't know. We haven't got a writer yet." And he said, "Well, what kind of songs do we write?" And I said, "Beatles songs. I don't know, 2 up-tempo, 2 ballads. I don't know. Write 6 new Beatles songs."